Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. It is Halloween, October 31st, 2025, and we certainly have some people acting like it's Halloween when they shouldn't be, perhaps trying to scare the entire world. We have President Trump's recent announcement, which has been backed up by now J.D. Vance and the Speaker Ron Johnson, that the U.S. is going to resume nuclear testing of nuclear weapons. There has been a ban on this for over 33 years. And the Russians said they haven't heard the U.S. is planning to remove its signature from this ban, but it's being doubled down on. And I think this is quite dangerous and alarming and insane. And it was the topic of the International Peace Coalition call earlier today with Helga LaRouche, which I would urge people to listen to at the Schiller Institute. Also, she focused on this amazing utterance of Pope Leo on the question of Nicholas of Cusa, on whom Helga LaRouche is probably the world expert, and the question of the coincidence of opposites, how you can unite seeming opposites from a higher standpoint, which makes peace actually possible. So I would encourage people to listen to that. Now, what we're going to be talking about tonight is the question of Albert Pike. Albert Pike was a Confederate general. He was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a leading member of the Scottish Rite Temple and B'nai B'rith, and I was involved for many years, along with a number of civil rights movement leaders, in protesting the statue where it was standing at Judiciary Square. How inappropriate in Washington, D.C., or appropriate depending on the kind of justice. Now, the statue was torn down. We were doing this in 1992 for several years, every single Friday, while Lyndon LaRouche, the leading American statesman, was sitting in federal prison in Rochester, Minnesota. And we're going to hear from him in just a minute. The statue was pulled down in 2020, something which I absolutely do not advocate. I think that statues have a place, maybe not in Judiciary Square. We were trying to have it removed for a number of years, and I would have proposed putting it in the Smithsonian, letting people know about the sordid history of the collaborators of the Confederacy, the pro-British traitors. Don't pull things down violently and lawlessly, but the statue has just been restored to its place in Judiciary Square. And I think this is very significant. And you'll hear Lyndon LaRouche talking about this, but I want to share with you something from a video which he recorded from prison. He said, "Look at this statue for a moment. Let's go back to the time of the man this statue depicts, General Albert Pike. To understand why the United States is in such a mess today, why we not only have these troubles within our nation, but also in our relations with the world at large, why the people in Washington seem to be incapable either of recognizing the problem or proposing effective solutions, why Clinton and Perot, as well as Bush, remember 1992 was an election year and we had a pack of not qualified candidates, as we typically seem to have. Clinton and Perot, as well as Bush, show not the slightest comprehension of what our problem is. We have to go back to the time of the Civil War, to the time of the man depicted by the statue, General Albert Pike, racist, traitor, and satanic degenerate." So you will hear those words in the video with more background from Mr. LaRouche, but I would ask you to just take a couple of examples today. What was the Ku Klux Klan? Extrajudicial lynchings. That is, there was no trial just because someone was accused, in the case of the Klan, an African-American man, of raping or harassing a white woman. They could go out and lynch the person. There was no need for a trial or proof or anything else. They would even drag people out of jail so they could lynch them. Really sick stuff. What do we have now going on in international waters? Well, there are boats which we are told contain the worst of the worst drug traffickers and lots of drugs. And we have now blown up 9 or 10. I'm losing count. I don't know if we've killed 43 people or 57 people. We're just killing them. No proof required. And even if there were proof, the procedure under international law and the US Constitution, if you say, hey, there's a rogue group there that are going to bring tons of damaging, mind-altering substances into the United States to do harm to our country, what do? You send the Coast Guard, you stop the boat, you board the boat, you apprehend the people there, you hold them in prison or wherever until there is a trial and the evidence is presented, and then they are guilty or not. You cannot just go around blowing up people. And this didn't originate with the Trump administration. We had it in spades with Barack Obama, who even assassinated an American citizen with drones in Pakistan, and who was routinely given, it was like a baseball card operation. Oh, gee, President Obama, who would you like to assassinate today? Oh, I don't know. Let me go through the file. Oh, yeah, why don't we take out this guy? A funeral, a wedding party, wherever it was. And guess what? When the United States behaved in that rogue, extrajudicial fashion of taking the law into the hands of some arbitrary megalomaniac, it didn't really make people like us. In fact, it created fertile recruitment grounds for terrorists. It's a bad idea. So the fight around the Albert Pike statue is just as relevant for today as it was then. And I think we will go right now to Mr. LaRouche.
Look at this statue for a moment. Let's go back to the time of the man this statue depicts, General Albert Pike. To understand why the United States is in such a mess today, why we not only have these troubles within our nation, but in our relations with the world at large, why the people in Washington seem to be incapable either of recognizing the problem or proposing effective solutions. We have to go back to the time of the Civil War, to the time of the man depicted by this statue. General Albert Pike, racist, traitor, and satanic degenerate. The fact that that statue has stood in Washington, D.C., near the Supreme Court, beside the Labor Department building, maintained on public land at public expense, shows that there is a pervasive corruption and ignorance inside our government, which is the cause for the continuation of our present problems. Let's go back to those events of the Civil War and trace it up to the present to see what the problem is and what we have to understand to solve the problem before us. What is called the U.S. Civil War, the most devastating war in our history, was not a war between the states. It was a civil war in the sense that a faction, including Bostonians such as Albert Pike, New Yorkers such as Slidell and so forth, were all part of a British conspiracy run through the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which took over control of the states with the aid of a traitor at the head of the Democratic Party, August Belmont, a confessed traitor, in order to destroy the United States by dividing it into several parts so that the British might control it.
New York would cut loose from the puritanical East. She would open her magnificent port to the commerce of the world as an independent city-state.
This was not a Southern conspiracy. It was a conspiracy by British-controlled traitors to the United States to take over the Southern states, the slave-owning states, as a way of dividing the United States into several parts, which might be kept in perpetual conflict with each other, to eliminate the United States as both a factor in world politics and also to weaken it to the point that the image of the United States, of the American Revolution, might be erased from the memory and hopes of people around the world. For example, Albert Pike, as we said, the traitor whose statue was seen, was from Boston. Louisiana Slidell was a in-law of August Belmont, the traitor from New York City. One of the worst of the traitors, Captain James Bullock, was the uncle and, for a considerable period of time, the political mentor of a president of the United States, his nephew, Teddy Roosevelt. The man who was president in 1901, the time that this statue was consecrated. In about 1853, Pike, a Bostonian, was sent down to the South by his fellow Bostonian, Caleb Cushing, also a member of the plot. By 1859, Pike had risen to the position of Supreme Commander of the Southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, and thus the Supreme Commander of the forces of the Confederate conspiracy, which had now moved to take over the relevant states against the opposition of such patriots as Texas's Sam Houston, who was opposed to this conspiracy. Pike, as head of the Southern Freemasons, was not only the racist who later formed the Ku Klux Klan at the Nashville, Tennessee Maxwell House Hotel in 1867, Pike was also a Satanist. In his own words, as Pike wrote in Paris in 1889, Pike explained the religion of his Freemasonic cult as follows.
The true philosophical religion is the belief in Lucifer, the equal of Adonai.
Pike's Freemasonic plot had two subordinate arms. The first, founded in 1843 at Charlotte, South Carolina, was the B'nai B'rith. And the B'nai B'rith was not the representation of Jewish organizations in the United States. Quite the contrary. The majority of Jews in the United States were violently opposed to slavery in the tradition of the Passover Seder. And during the Civil War, fought or otherwise aided the Union in the cause of crushing slavery and maintaining the Union. The B'nai B'rith was founded as the pro-slavery racist faction among Jews. The B'nai B'rith of Freemasonry became the Confederate spy organization, later headed by Judah Benjamin, who was involved in the plot to kill Lincoln, among other things, and who worked very closely with Pike. In fact, Judah Benjamin played a key role, together with Pike, in founding the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee in 1867. The second subordinate organization of relevance of the southern jurisdiction of Freemasonry was what was the fighting arm of Freemasonry, which was known originally as the Knights of the Golden Circle, precursor of the Ku Klux Klan. These three elements, Pike's Freemasonic Lucifer-worshipping cult, B'nai B'rith, and the Ku Klux Klan, have been continuously interconnected from 1867 down through present day. At the time Lincoln was inaugurated, the Confederacy went into open secession, open revolt. At that time, the enemies of the United States, the leading enemies of the United States, were Britain under the leadership of Lord Palmerston, who was otherwise known as the author of the Second and Third Opium Wars against China, and Palmerston's political catamite, the man that Palmerston in fact put into power in France, Napoleon III. In friends of the United States were Russia, the Russia of Tsar Alexander II, more specifically, and also the Meiji Restoration Forces in Japan, friends in Germany, and you might not know it, but it's significant, the King of Thailand. This alignment of friends and enemies became crucial in the course of the 20th century. By 1862, it became clear that once Lincoln had replaced more or less treasonous generals like General McClellan, the protege of August Belmont, who refused to win the Battle of Antietam, that the United States was organized in such a fashion that by its own means the Union would win the battle against the Confederacy, unless outside military interference occurred to prevent that from occurring. At that time, Lord Palmerston's Britain and France's Napoleon III agreed to deploy British and French naval forces to attempt to break the Union blockade of the Confederacy and thus enable France and Britain to reinforce the Confederacy, perhaps not to win the Civil War, but to make it so costly that the United States would bend to the will of the British government and accept a separate peace with the British Confederate puppet. At that point, Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, intervened. He prepared to send naval forces, which he did in 1863, to aid the United States. The Russian Navy arrived at New York City and San Francisco on friendship visits. And the commanders of these flotillas, these Russian flotillas, had sealed orders. In the event that Napoleon III or Britain or both should intervene against the Union to attempt to break the Union blockade or other actions, these sealed orders would be opened, and Russia would go to war against Britain and France in aid of its ally, the Union. At that point, Britain backed down, and the United States was able to settle its internal affairs by its own means. That began a worldwide movement under which the United States was implicitly the ally or the friend of Alexander II's Russia and of Germany against our deadly enemies, Britain and Napoleon III's France, until about the end of the century when things began to change. During that period, despite the assassination of Alexander II by forces friendly to Britain inside Russia, the policy of Alexander II was continued. A small group of the Russian nobility and others continued this admiration of the American system policy. At the same time, Witte, the leader of various governments of the Tsar, reached out to Germany and to France in the effort to get continental cooperation for a general development, economic development of all of Eurasia, based on cooperation initially in building railway lines which would extend from Brest in the coast of France through Paris to Vladivostok. And of course the Germans had a related policy of moving a rail line from Berlin to Baghdad. The British reacted with violence to this because they saw that the economic development of continental Eurasia meant an end to their dream of a worldwide, single, one-world British Empire. The idea that the United States, which had been traditionally, since Lincoln at least, had been allied with Russia, or at least that faction in Russia which Witte represented, and with the more positive forces in Germany, and forces around the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which in the 19th century were very close to the United States, and forces for independence, anti-British forces, such as those of Sun Yat-sen, for example, in China, that these forces united would mean an end to the British Empire, and the British had to break up that coalition. And thus we had in the 20th century, this upsurge of wars and revolutions, including World War I, which were entirely orchestrated by the British. If we do not root out of our republic the treason, the corruption, the degeneracy, which Albert Pike and his collaborators and followers represent, there is no chance that the United States will prevail as a nation, either in its domestic affairs or its foreign affairs. Unless we act now to reject all lesser evils which compromise with what this statue symbolizes, there is no hope that the United States will escape the kind of hell which world famine, world disease, spreading war, and economic depression generally portend.
And it is our duty, according to the founders of the Declaration of Independence, it is our duty to pull it down. It is our duty to remove it.
Now that we've heard from Lyndon LaRouche on this question, some of my colleagues, Jose Vega, congressional candidate running in the Bronx against incumbent Congressman Richie Torres, and Anton Chaikin, a historian and collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche for many years, who did a lot of the research on the traitor networks in the United States, including Albert Pike. We're down at the Pike statue today, earlier, and we're going to hear from them.
Jose Vega, congressional candidate running for Congress in the 15th Congressional District. Today I am in my possible future home here in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined by Mr. Anton Chaikin, who can introduce himself. Please.
Hi. Well, I'm Anton Chaikin. I'm a historian, and we're standing next to the restored Pike statue. It shouldn't be here. Shouldn't have been here from the very beginning. So,
absolutely. So tell me more about your history with this statue. Well, first of all, tell me about the statue, period. What is the statue? It doesn't, there's a giant fence around this statue, but nobody seems to care. I mean, you and I are the only ones here and a few others behind the camera.
well, this was reinstalled after it was ripped down by a mob in 2020. It was reinstalled just a few days ago by the Trump administration on the anniversary, I think, of its first being put up in 1901. The Albert Pike, who is celebrated here, was a Confederate general, and he was a leader, strategist, and one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan in the period after the Civil War. And it's outstandingly inappropriate for this statue to ever have been here in the national capital. So we used to have protests against that statue when it was standing there before the mob took it down. That was back in 1992. So I have an old history with this. I was the one that looked into Pike's background and brought out the old literature that showed that he was the Ku Klux Klan leader. It was well known that he was a Confederate general. In either case, it's inappropriate for the statue to be here, but it's a representative of the old establishment that our national leaders and real American leaders have always fought against. The financiers of the Northeast, together with the old slave-owning and racist South establishment, that was a combination that went against our national progress always. And Pike represents both of those. He was a northerner who went south and led the secession in Arkansas, and then helped to put together a terror organization against the people, the freed black people, and against the national government. And now he's celebrated by the national government.
So
Why
this
is that?
Yeah, so this statue was first put up in 1901.
Yeah.
Can you tell me why this statue was put up in 1901 here in the Capitol?
At the time, there was a power struggle going on. The president was William McKinley, and he was an advocate for peace and for the progress of living standards. He was a civil rights advocate. He had been a soldier for the Union in the Civil War, and he was under pressure from the imperial establishment led by Teddy Roosevelt. The president was under pressure to go to war, to turn towards imperialism. We had had peace since the Civil War, 30 years. And so at the time, while he was under that pressure and trying to resist getting into a stupid foreign war for conquest, the Congress people put through the Congress a bill to have a statue honoring this guy, supposedly because he was a Freemason. And they didn't mention his Klan background or discuss it being a Confederate general. So McKinley signed this bill while he was paying attention to this huge crisis about whether we would go to war. A few days later, he was forced into this decision to allow for the declaration of war against Spain and the conquest of Philippines and Cuba. A little bit later on, I can't remember the date that this occurred, but then in 1901, not long after this, McKinley was assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt, his enemy, who had been forced onto the ticket with him to run for vice president, Teddy Roosevelt became president by the assassination of his enemy, the president. And Teddy Roosevelt took the country onto the path towards war, alliance with Great Britain, and restoration of this alliance of the North financiers and Southern racists. A month after Teddy Roosevelt became president, by the assassination of the president, the statue was unveiled.
Wow.
They're very dramatic circumstances. There were protests at the time against this happening.
That's amazing. That this statue and Albert Pike represents a total subversion of the United States of America. I mean, the guy was a traitor, and he found the Ku Klux Klan, and yet they decide. I read somewhere this is the only outdoor statue in Washington, D.C. Is that true?
No, it's the only statue in Washington, D.C. that is representing a Confederate general, a Confederate officer or soldier. There's only monuments to people who fought for our country or who did something for the country. And so at the time, the veterans protested this. The governor of Arkansas, his name was Powell Clayton, during the Reconstruction era, had fought against the Klan led by Albert Pike. And he wrote a book later on noting how, with dripping sarcasm about the fact that he has a statue honoring somebody like this standing in the national Capitol. He wrote this book in 1912. So this was always a sore point of how did this establishment that was not in power under Lincoln, it wasn't in power under Grant.
Yeah.
We had our own government. There were several presidents that asserted themselves for our country's progress. And at the founding, George Washington and with Alexander Hamilton promoted this progress, and others. Later on, Franklin Roosevelt. These were real leaders of our country. So this statue represents the covert, violent arm of this transatlantic establishment from London to Wall Street now.
So tell me then about, now let's go up a little bit more, past 1912, up to the LaRouche organization and why they took and you took such a big interest in this statue. You guys were doing demonstrations here in the late 1980s?
It was in 1992, I believe. Yeah.
Lyndon LaRouche is in jail.
Yes,
right?
That's right. He was. And so we had, I had written a book called Treason in America, and I covered Albert Pike's background before the Civil War. And then I had looked into the background of the statue and deeper, and I discovered these facts that were really indisputable, that he had been a leader of the Klan that nobody discussed. It was certainly not on the pedestal. So we had a series of rallies out here while LaRouche was in jail and others were in jail. And it was to bring to the attention of the public the identity and the real character of this establishment.
And these were like every other day or something,
No,
right?
it was every Friday.
Every Friday,
Yeah,
okay.
every Friday. We used to have the rallies there. At one point, a young man who was in our entourage around the statue actually did climb up the statue and put Klan robes appropriately on the thing. And there are some wonderful photographs of the statue festooned in the right way. We had these rallies every Friday. We would also come across the street here to the mayor's office when Mayor Barry, Marion Barry was mayor, and we held some classes in political economy. I was working with Dennis Speed, who was the organizer of these rallies. And so we had Hosea Williams, who was an old civil rights leader,
Yeah.
and Reverend Bevel, James Bevel, who had run for vice president with Lyndon LaRouche in that, I think it was the 1992
1992,
election.
right. Lynn is in jail and Bevel's running for vice president.
Yeah, and so he was out there with me, and we were doing this rally, these series of rallies, and they were educational. We weren't calling for any violence at all. We wanted to have the U.S. government come to its senses and to take the statue down and put it in an appropriate place where the public could be educated about this terroristic establishment that we hopefully could get beyond in our world.
So let's talk about 2020. I think the statue is taken down, right, by the Black Lives Matter riots that were happening around the death of George Floyd. People decide to come here, they put ropes, and then they yank it down, right? So that was 5 years ago.
Yeah,
right?
They set fire to it. Somebody put some accelerant on it. And so I don't think that they were really paying attention to, or they didn't know about the background of this particular statue. It's obviously very unique in our country because it has this sort of amazing and insane background that you have such an exciting and dramatic past to the person, and it's not indicated on the statue. So
Yeah.
it was taken down in a kind of a mindless way in 2020. And then it was the Park Service police that had arrested me and Bevel and put it. We served 6 days in jail in the DC jail on charges of statue climbing. So that was at the time of one of these rallies. But so the Park Service police put the burnt statue, what was left of it, in storage. And then it was decided by the Trump administration, by somebody in the Trump administration,
We don't know who.
that it should be restored. And I think it's a good indication, because it's obviously an embarrassment to President Trump to put up such a statue if he knew what he was doing. I don't believe he's running the government. I think that this shows you the Republicans said that Biden wasn't the real president, and they made a big deal out of that. Well, I think that can be said now. Who's doing this attempted war against Venezuela? Who's doing the wars with Russia, the sending the bombs to Israel? The idea that won a mandate in the 2024 elections and the 2020 elections and the 2016 elections was for the progress of jobs, against free trade, and for normalization of relations with Russia. Peace. That's what the public wants.
Yeah.
And clearly the president is not he's lurching back and forth. It shows you the power, the grasp, let's put it this way, of the establishment represented by that statue that's still there. And that's the problem.
Yeah.
Is who's running the government.
That's why I think that this point about who's running the government is very clear with this statue, because this statue went up in 1901. Donald Trump didn't run on let's put the statue back up.
Right.
And he didn't make a big public fanfare about it either, right? Somebody made the decision to put this up. Because the fact that you guys were out here in 1992 every Friday calling attention to the general public saying this is up here, right? And it still didn't come down. But at least you guys were making it known what this statue was. Yeah. And the fact that it was quietly put back up. I mean, I only saw a few local articles talking about this. You know, I think it's insane that there aren't more people out here protesting this. And I think if Donald Trump knew what this really meant and what it was actually about, he might be inclined to take it down. That's what I personally think. But I look at the ICE raids that are happening today. I look at the National Guard everywhere. I see the fact that we have these wars like you're talking about, right? And I think all of that is because of who's actually running the government, which is the point you're making. Because the same person or people or groups of people that are dictating the wars, that are dictating the adversarial natures towards Russia and China, are the same people making the decisions about putting up this statue. And so that's my 2 cents. I know I shouldn't have been overstepping my boundaries as the interviewer here, but no, I think we've got enough here for Diane Sayre's show. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
I would say that the natural character of not only Americans but every people is to want to have peaceful and friendly relations with others. They want to have a good job. They want to have a successful family. And from my study of history, studying outrageous phenomena like the Ku Klux Klan, you can see that when people act like savages, when they're put into wars, it's highly unnatural. You can prove the benevolent character of human beings and the unnatural and forced character of wars and that type of thing from a decent study of history. You bring it out by looking at creatures like Albert Pike and the people who, in a noble way, fought against him.
Maestro Chaikin, thank you kindly. This is Jose Vega and Anton Chaikin signing off here for Diane Sayre's symposium.
Well, thank you, Jose Vega and Anton Chaikin. I'm really glad you were able to be here, and I remember those rallies so well. Beethoven's Seventh Symphony was played through the loudspeaker system every week before speeches began. And actually, one of the things that we used to chant was 2 things you will find in hell, Albert Pike and the ADL. Because with that campaign, and perhaps appropriately, you heard me, those of you listening to the show from the beginning, earlier mention, and Mr. LaRouche brings it up in his comments from prison in 1992, that Pike was also involved in the B'nai B'rith, which was a Masonic organization, a pro-Confederate organization, not a nation dedicated to stopping anti-Semitism, but an organization dedicated to treason. And the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith was a spin-off of that. The Anti-Defamation League, as you might suspect, had its origins in organized crime, people like Meyer Lansky, Edgar Bronfman, etc. And in fact, Lyndon LaRouche did not get labeled as an anti-Semite until he commissioned a book called Dope Incorporated in 1976, I believe, Dope Inc., which was part of his campaign for an actual war on drugs, not a war on young people, a war on our cities, a war on minorities, what you had under Joe Biden. But the idea that if you wanted to shut down the drug trade, you go after the money. You go after the big guys running the drug trade, not the poor, desperate people who are sucked in to be the foot soldiers of it. And I'm not saying that people who are trafficking or engaged in terrorist gangs should be allowed to run around, but they don't run the thing. I mean, that would just be stupid to believe that. And no sooner did Lyndon LaRouche call for going after these banks than the ADL came after him, hook, line, and sinker. And today, the power of this group, which some might call the Zionist lobby, is being shattered. We had just in the last couple of days, Tucker Carlson interviewed Nick Fuentes, someone whose views I don't particularly share, but Nick Fuentes was bringing up the influence of people like Bill Ackman, Miriam Adelson, two very prominent multimillionaire billionaires who have thrown hundreds of millions of dollars into various campaigns in hope of controlling political outcomes, and why they have so much sway in American politics, to the point that the kept monster of the British in the Middle East, namely Bibi Netanyahu and his right-wing extremist cabinets, can get away with carrying out a genocide over the last 2 years. And what has happened is now people are calling for Tucker Carlson's head on a platter, because he's been expressing this along with people like Candace Owens, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And of course, we saw what happened to Charlie Kirk, and I cannot say who assassinated him. I'm not going to attempt to lay blame here, but one of the things that has been confirmed is that 48 hours before he was assassinated, Charlie Kirk mentioned that he had lost a $2 million a year donor because he insisted on having Tucker Carlson speaking at a Turning Point event, and that he was done with supporting Israel. So you can consider yourselves what that actually means. At any rate, what happened is the president of the Heritage Foundation, a conservative lobby think tank, a man named Kevin Roberts, was pressed to disavow his friendship and relationship with Tucker Carlson. And he said, no, I'm not going to. I will not be pressed by globalist interests, people who are enemies of the United States. He said, I'm fine to have, if we have reasons for collaborating with Israel on intelligence, on security, that's fine. But I'm not going to put the interests of another nation ahead of the interests of my nation, the United States and the American people. And then I happened to hear earlier today, I guess yesterday, or I'm not sure when, there was a major Turning Point conference addressed by Vice President J.D. Vance. And one of the young people there wearing a MAGA hat asked J.D. Vance, I thought we were for America first, and I'm wondering why the United States keeps giving all this multi-billions of dollars to this nation so it can, and I'm quoting Charlie Kirk, the young man said, carry out an ethnic cleansing. What is this? And the room applauded. And then J.D. Vance said, I'm just doing a kind of summary, that people say that Trump is under the control of Israel, but it was Donald Trump who pressured Bibi Netanyahu to get the ceasefire, which we all knew that Netanyahu was the problem in ending this war and has been the whole time. And we know the despicable policy of ethnic cleansing, mass starvation. And we know the Israelis just 2 nights ago, supposedly because Hamas killed one IDF soldier, and there's even questions whether it was Hamas that killed that soldier because it occurred in an area where Hamas is not running things. But nonetheless, an IDF soldier gets killed and 104 Palestinians get killed, including 46 children, which is very similar to what Hitler announced during World War II, that if anyone killed a German soldier, that the Nazi army would kill 50 to 100 of them. So it's done. The control on American politics by this treasonous lobby, which, let me say, has nothing to do with Judaism. It is the British Empire. It is organized crime. And the American people, thanks to, frankly, a fantastic organizing job done by the Palestinian people using social media, doctors who have gone to Gaza, people who have been witness to the horrible crimes being committed in our name, people have rejected it. The world is sick. Normal people do not believe in killing children, in starving people to death, in collective punishment. And it's time that this ends. But to go back to the beginning of our discussion tonight, Lyndon LaRouche said back in 1992 from prison, the fact that the Pike statue was in Judiciary Square, and I will say the fact that the Pike statue has just been restored to Judiciary Square is indicative of the type of problems that we see in the leadership of this nation. And therefore, it is incumbent on the American people to master the principles which led us to declare our independence from the British Empire and to commit oneself to those principles, the principle that every single human being is created equal, endowed with inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are formed among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We have to defend that, and I will say the Constitution, the various reasons of why we, the American people, formed this nation, have to do with to establish justice, secure domestic tranquility, common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. But these are not just mindless, fruity-tooty ideas. How do you put flesh on those bones? And that's where Lyndon LaRouche was a complete expert in the science of physical economy, not how to get rich on Wall Street, but how to ensure that you have a growing population with a rising standard of living from one generation to next, that the children born 5 generations from today, or 7, as the Native American standard is, you must think 7 generations ahead, will be better people. They will live longer, they will be better educated, they will master more languages, they will be classical musicians, they will be physicists, they will be geniuses, and they will be kind, and they will love their fellow human beings, and we will have a different order of relations among mankind. So that's where we're going, and therefore we can thank the Trump administration, I suppose, for putting this Pike statue back in place so that we could have this discussion. But now that we've had it, let's get that statue down and put it in the museum where it belongs. And we will talk again.